with the assumption that any rationale or judgment model that that population uses is valid. Objectives of deliberation. The design of the engagement should not be allowed to drive outcomes. And this is one of the things that I think has happened with some engagement events, is because they're built upon a particular philosophical ideal, the design of the engagement drives what outcomes are possible for it, and then we get some very bad fit between some of the outcomes that are done in terms of the studies and the design of the engagement event. And clearly define the outcomes that are supposed to drive the design. Clearly design the outcomes that are supposed to define the outcomes that drive the design. All right, so what does that mean in terms of this specific grant for the applications to the NERT? Site selection. I think the nano district mapping is a good guidance on cities. If we want to look at places where people are concerned, might be concerned, or should be concerned about nano, the work that's being done on nano district mapping, where they're mapping where publications and patents for nanotechnology are occurring, and we've got now maps from the people down at Georgia who are giving us an entire country, and they're breaking it up along a number of different where's industry, where's government, where's education, etc. So we can look at locating cities on the basis of the nano district mapping, and I think that's probably what we'll do. Fortunately, Raleigh just happens to be a good site on the nano district maps. Population diversity within the cities should be guided by existing venue selection. So within each city, we're going to have to look for multiple venues that have diversities of populations within those venues. So some of the things that come out of the Pew Center, which Schäufele was talking about yesterday, in terms of looking at the differences of populations that go to science museums versus public libraries, for example, indicate differences and how we can still acquire diversity of the population we're looking at by looking at diversity of sites. The interesting thing is, I think, although I don't think there's much evidence on this, but I think it's not a contentious claim, we'll also get a diversity of ecologies that we'll be studying, social, cultural, and communicative ecologies as a result. Diverse virtual spaces also where engagement would not be alien or intrusive. And by virtual spaces, I mean online communities, etc. There are some in which there is an explicit expectation that you don't have political conversations. If you go into some multiplayer, massively online games, and you start a political conversation, you are quickly told in some communities it is simply not appropriate. Engagement would be alien and intrusive there, and hence we'd not be studying a space in which opinion formation is likely to happen. But there are online communities where it's highly likely and very familiar. Information and framing. We want to pretest on information sources or extrapolate from previous studies in order to talk about the information sources we should bring into these populations that we study. Once we know what cities we're in and what the existing venues look like, we want to get information or be able to extrapolate from previous studies to know what information sources to bring them. We can use things like the Nexus database, YouTube, etc. for population appropriate materials, and then convert that material into the media format most appropriate. So for example, YouTube for television audiences can be converted pretty easily straight into a television show. Right? You have television shows about nanotechnology up on YouTube, you just convert them back over to DVD, show them as a television show. Nexus database gives us where the articles are, then we deal with the newspapers to get the actual physical image of the, so we don't elide elements like layout components and visuals, if for people who utilize newspapers as a source. Work with local journalism students for simulated material where necessary. Ideally, what I'd like to do, when we need to simulate material, take people who are being professionally trained to make that material, preferably in the local markets where we're studying, and have them make the simulated material. Now, that may not always be possible, but it'll produce a more naturalized body of simulated material. And do not police information flow. If it's a porous community in which information flow is high, let information flow be high. Deliberative methods. We want to observe as much as possible before, during, and after, if possible. We'd like to watch their deliberative methods before we give them information or ask them about nanomaterials, during their conversations about it, and after if we can. Now, that may not always be possible given the distance and the siting that we're doing, but that would be ideal. Minimize observer influence, which is very difficult, of course, and record as much raw data as possible and code later. Video recording with full audio would be an ideal situation. It would give us so much raw data, and then we could cut it apart, code it, mess with it by observer coding, a million different ways, qualitative and quantitative, however we want, humanistic study, etc. later. There's some problems with that, obviously. But remember, our objective is to collect data on participants' perceptions of nanotechnology's risks and their methods of collectively forming those opinions. That is what drives these decisions for me. Now, some cautions I think I should levy at the end here about data collection from these kinds of engagement events. First is, Asking about risk can increase risk perception. We've seen this in a lot of risk perception studies, and it's much like anxiety. If you survey people about their anxiety tends to increase. When you survey people and you ask them directly about risk perception tends to increase. So we'll either need particularly nuanced indirect ways, or we'll have to let that conversation organically emerge. And if it doesn't, that should tell us something as well. Pre-tests can produce interpretive frames of salience. I read a study not lately, and the author will name anonymous for this purpose, but they pre-tested and post-tested in order to gauge education from public engagement events. This is what they did. They gave a multiple choice questionnaire of 6 objective answers about nanotechnology, multiple choice, and then did the public engagement event, and then at the end gave the exact same 6 questions to the audience and measured whether or not they answered more of them correctly at the end or the beginning. This is like me giving my students a quiz, teaching the material, and then giving them a quiz again, the exact same quiz again at the very end. You've primed them. You've told them what's salient, right? So pre-test, post-test produce interpretive frames for what happens in the engagement event based on salience. Self-reporting only usually, or may at least only measure, reporter perception. When we do anxiety studies, for example, we differentiate between observer anxiety, physiologically measured anxiety, and self-perceived anxiety. Surveys give us self-perceived anxiety. So when we ask people about empowerment, what we're asking about is their self-perceived empowerment. Influence outcome engagement may actually survey desired influences. If we tell a population that the results of what we are doing will influence policymakers because we'll communicate to them, they may answer questions on the basis of what they want the desired influence to policymakers to be. In which case, we have to ask the question about what the surveys are getting us. However, observations are not immune from some of these problems as well. Observations, of course, can alter participant behavior. This is a well-known problem, documented in 1,000 different ways. And recording can amplify the effect of observation on participant behavior. Knowing that I'm webcast right now certainly has some influence and effect on the kinds of things I may or may not say to you. And surveys also tend to capture less of the ecology and communication than observation does, and particularly video observation is ideal for this. If you want to study one-up, one-down communication behaviors, you've got to have the nonverbals, you've got to have the paralinguistic elements to code it. Self-transparency, I've also talked about this, is of course dubious, right? And so there is some significant problem with self-transparency. I'll conclude about some of the thoughts on our data collection. I want to reduce reliance on surveys, but retain them where appropriate. For demographic items, for basic information, for information where surveys are really the fastest, most efficient, and clean way to get it, we'll keep them. But try to record in the least intrusive way possible, ideally full video, all of the interactions that go on. Then do quantitative coding of recorded events with multiple coders and established schemes. Qualitative analysis of communication strategies and dynamics. And we're probably going to have to commit some hundreds of personnel hours to the events and the analysis afterwards. Luckily, there's lots of us. So hundreds of personnel hours doesn't mean hundreds of hours for any one particular person, except maybe me. My final thoughts are, this is not intended to replace or displace existing engagement models. For those who are into the activist model and want a transformative mechanism, this is wholly inappropriate. Deliberative democracy is your game. Go for it. Practicable democracy is and always must be a work in progress. I do not intend this to be a model. It's an orientation. It can't be a model because of its attention to localism. And finally, I have to appeal for help. Right? The broad diversity of kind of literature that goes into a project like this means that I'm absolutely dependent upon things like this and all of you and my colleagues, not only on the grant, but not on the grant, to be feeding into it. Only by virtue of a conference like this did I wind up running across how good the brand new nano maps are, which just got published like a couple of months ago in there. So your feedback, feeding us data, feeding us sources, feeding us citations, I mean, this is crossing everything from rhetoric to political science, the humanities, the social sciences, all the way throughout, is absolutely vital to the success of these kind of programs. So I want to thank you in advance and thank you also for all of you who've already provided so much material for us. Appreciate it.